So good morning, everyone. I do feel this situation has happened often to me because I am like from MIT, and I don't know how often we do also these live, global, very ambitious things, and and you run into all the fundamental problems, and then what really is that true? MIT, and you can't put these two things together. So I have been in that situation also quite often. So I want to share this morning a few experiences and stories around two guiding questions that interest me most. One is how to use the power of technology for good, basically. And as we all know, Wahil, Godim, and others kind of from the Arab Spring Revolution and so on, there is kind of, with many people, a sense that social media is good at breaking things, but is it also good at making things? So that has been called into question by social change activists more recently. So how to use technology for good is one question. And the other one is how to use the power of mindfulness not only for the cultivation of the individual, but also for the evolution and transformation of larger systems, of the collective. So that's really what's interesting me and the intersection of these two questions. So I want to also introduce my colleague and co-creator of ULab at MIT and the Presencing Institute, Adam Yukelson, who on short notice is in town and kind of is able to also join in for the discussion later today. So I want to start off with, I know no one can see it, but maybe some remote. So it's basically, we have it here. Wonderful, we have it here. So it's that kind of situation. I just find it interesting that, and I'm sure many of you have experienced that as well. You go to other countries, you go to other systems and communities, this kind of feeling that, a feeling of disruptive change is true on many levels of scale today. On an individual level, organizationally, kind of we face disruption. Certainly kind of here in Europe, right? I mean, no one needs to explain that. But also worldwide with the ecological and social and other challenges. And now, how do we, so everyone is talking about disruption. That's no longer anything new. What's the perspective we take from a mindfulness, or kind of the term we use kind of is presencing. And we mean by presencing the capacity of sensing and actualizing emerging future possibilities. So what's the perspective we take? The perspective we take is that each of us and each human system and social system today is not only sitting on this side, kind of the current reality side of disruption, but one part of ourselves is also located here on the other side. In other words, which is kind of representing the emerging future. In other words, we operate on the assumption that the future is already there. We just need to learn how to notice it and pay attention to it, because it's usually not kind of inside our bubble. It's not kind of in our main focus, but it may be a little left and right. And that's a little bit the topic I want to follow. So the two ideas, the two kind of guiding ideas we use is, the first one I'm sure you have seen many times. It's the iceberg model, systems thinking. 10% is visible, the other 90% also important, also matters. And so it's like on the surface we have symptoms, then there is structures and systems underneath. For example, if we look at the current situation in Europe, you could say kind of symptoms is Brexit, kind of a lot of people disenchanted kind of with the European project. You could say underneath structures and systems, a lot of systemic disconnects, right? If you look at the map, the vote, when was it? Last week. There's one way of interpret that. It's basically representing inequity and commitment to do something about it, right? So it's kind of the long-term results of the Thatcher revolution that are visible also in the vote. So many people having the feeling that the systems, the bigger the system, the more the mistrust and disappointment, because it's accumulated kind of in your life experience. And we see similar patterns kind of in the rise of the Trump phenomenon and the rise of the right here across all countries in Europe, and similar phenomena also in Asia. So, but then what's underneath? What's driving? So there's a lot, a number of systemic disconnects that, I could, the disconnect between, for example, finite resources and the infinite growth paradigm. So that's, an obvious one, kind of related to the ecological crisis. But it's also like a disconnect between the real economy and the financial economy, right? Kind of when you there is kind of something getting out of sync. And so there is, and there are kind of a disconnect, also well known, between GDP and well-being, right? For all developed countries, more GDP does not translate into more well-being. So it's no longer a good measure for economic progress. If it's not GDP, then what is it? Kind of these kinds of questions. But if you go a little deeper underneath, kind of the next deeper level of root causes, I believe, has to do particularly with root causes that originate between our ears, that originate in our qualities of thought, particularly the outdated paradigms of economic thought that we still use and teach at business schools and use to design economic institutions based on which we operate. So you can say thinking creates the world in many ways. And what we see today, the enacted economic reality, is really an embodiment of yesterday's paradigm of economic thought. So, and when you look at the evolution of the economic thought and the evolution of the economy, you can see kind of a movement from centralized to free market, laissez-faire capitalism to a more social market economy like 20th century OECD countries. And today, at the beginning of the 21st century, kind of we move from this 3.0 economy. We believe there's a possibility in the current crisis to progress to a 4.0 economy in which the three sectors, business, government, civil society, no longer just work against each other, but begin to work with each other in order to innovate at the scale of the whole system, right? Addressing some of these bigger issues like inequity or like connected to the ecological crisis. So that's, you could say, the basic view that we have been taking. In other words, we see the evolution of the economy, of the modern economy, based on distribution of labor, and the evolution of economic thought as an embodiment of human consciousness that moves from traditional awareness, like loyalty, fitting in, to ecosystem awareness, which is what we still teach at business schools today, Homo economicus, to a stakeholder awareness, which is what we use in all real companies or governmental institutions today, to what we believe is foundational, will be foundational this century, which is ecosystem awareness, by which we mean an awareness that's not only focusing on my well-being, ecosystem awareness, or the well-being of a few key stakeholders, stakeholder awareness, but that's focusing on the well-being of all partners kind of in an ecosystem, particularly those kind of that are least connected and most disadvantaged. So that's, the past 15 years, I've done many projects in sustainability, education, health, business. And basically, in all these situations, you face the same basic issue that to make progress on the big challenges today, no one can do it alone, right? You need to bring it together a diverse group of stakeholders that need each other to make progress. And then, once you did that, you need to help them to move from a silo type of viewpoint and interaction, or ecosystem awareness, to ecosystem awareness, which is a view that is more embedded in a whole system view. And that's basically our bread and butter. I mean, that's what we have been doing. So let me quickly, we developed basically a method that is, taking people who, want to engage on this ego to ecosystem process on a journey that moves through observe, kind of seeing the system from the edges, deep reflection, rapid cycle prototyping like design thinking, but that also invites people to basically do some inner leadership work, which is basically quality of listening, right? So seeing your system from different angles doesn't help if you still project your old habits of judgment, right? So it's like the inner leadership work that we believe is necessary today is basically, the development of 3 inner instruments of knowing that we call open mind, open heart, open will. And open mind really means suspend your old habits of thought, right? Kind of look with fresh eyes into a situation. Open heart really means look at it, so develop the capacity to look at a problem not from your angle, but from the angle of your stakeholders, right? From, the partners you're working with. And in all network leadership challenges, that's the number one, capacity that you need to be effective in situations like that. And the third one, open will, is basically the capacity to let go and let come. That's the reason why usually mergers don't work, right? So it's because we hold on to the old definition of us versus them, and thereby, block an evolution to a new we, or kind of a new kind of an evolution to connect to the deeper sources of knowing. So that's basically what we have been doing. There's like, but I'm not going into that because if you can't see the pictures, there's, it's maybe, we have been using that in a number of projects. In public sector, private sector, but, the bottom line is you can't do it. It does work. It takes a lot of effort, but what are kind of some of the deeper shifts that you can observe there? And I think this is a visible one. So this is a little summary slide here. What we notice if you take systems through a journey, kind of where you move basically from the me to we shift, right? Where people begin across organization and sector boundaries to communicate in a more fluid, in a more direct way, and therefore kind of develop a more distributed intelligence that allows people to co-sense kind of what the current situation is like, and develop ideas and explore them quickly with experimentation. The main shift that happens is not only outcomes that you create, for example, reducing maternal mortality and so forth, but it's a mindset shift that can be summarized with this picture here. It's a mindset shift from this way of seeing the system as something out there to seeing the system that way, which is a way that includes myself as part of the picture. So that's really, at the end of the day, if you have a successful process, that's kind of the fundamental mindset shift that, if in place, allows you to be much more effective in dealing with issues, kind of, and when you have a conflict situation, a real conflict situation, different interests kind of clashing, to come up kind of with productive ways of dealing with that. And when you move from this mindset, the reality is out there, to this mindset as an individual, right? What do you call that? What's the word for that? What's the English word that we use for that shift? What do we call, how do we label the second state? What's that?
It's a
Transformation, yeah. Transformation, what are other words for that?
Empathy.
Yeah, well, in a way you could say, I mean, it's like seeing yourself as part of the system. You know, often like there's empathy with others, empathy with self. Yeah, that's connected to that. I think a lot has to do with the term mindfulness. And if you look at the field of leadership, I mean, you know, like, which is my field, and you know, like I know, everything has been said too often by too many people already. So what is really new? Very little things when you look at the whole field. But one of the things I think that truly is new, let's say the past 10, 15 years, is the rise of mindfulness from being a very marginal term 10, 15 years ago to being very central, almost mainstream in 4 different areas. It's cognition science, health and well-being, education, the whole movement around social emotional learning, and now the 4th one, you know, as you can see in Davos and other places, leadership. And why is it like more than maybe a personal interest? Because you know, this kind of capacity to seeing reality out there towards seeing myself as part of the problem, of course, is a key capacity that in any kind of change process you want to foster, you want to develop. So if that happens to a group, moving from here, this mindset, right, which is like a debate when you have communication in that mindset, and you move to that style of talking, that's dialogue, right? Dialogue is not people talking with each other. Dialogue is the capacity of a system to see itself, to reflect on your own assumption. And yay, you did it. Okay, wonderful. So it's not quite synchronized with what I show here, but you know, it's moving in that direction. So making a system see itself is not only, you could say a key feature of dialogue. It's also when you know, 50% of all change management. Because, you know, if, you know, I see the system out there, the problems we face, it's because of all these idiots around me, right? All the other departments and so on. And it's only if we shift the way we talk and the mindset that's underneath to a way where I am part of the problem, where I see how I, in my way of framing, as contributing to the problem. Only then, you know, when you deal with multiple stakeholders, you start to having a useful conversation. So in that regard, this shift, this ego to eco shift, kind of that is really has to do a lot with this capacity to bend the beam of observation back onto kind of the observing self, back onto making a group not only sense but also see itself as really the essence, you could say, of systems thinking and systems thinking based change processes. So when we abstract now from that and say, okay, so that's kind of where you could say a shift in consciousness is happening, right? So if you don't like consciousness, take awareness. If you don't like awareness, take mindset or take kind of the way we pay attention. Paying attention is essential for all leadership because energy follows attention. So wherever you pay attention to, that's where the energy, you know, your own, but also the energy of the people around you is moving. So we know that. That's why, and you know, what is essentially meditation? It's about paying attention, right? You know, deepening and honing our capacity to focus, to pay attention in a way that is not diluted by distraction, by, you know, attention deficit, hyperactivity, disorder kind of symptoms. So what does that look like? So if we look at, all right, so we still cannot see it, right?
Yes, we can.
Oh, we can, okay. All right, so here, so basically, we develop social technologies that is accelerating that shift, right? Because, usually if you go through processes and making a complex system sense and see itself, and thereby kind of shifting the way the mindset, but also the communication and collaboration is shifting. That's a big thing to do. It usually takes a lot of effort. So we developed social technologies, and I just show you a few pictures. This is a multi-stakeholder group in Indonesia. It's focusing on one of the biggest multi-stakeholder projects currently existing. It's the Call Triangle Initiative, which is the second most important ecosystem after the Amazon region on the planet. Now, and they map all the different systems. Now, in our case, because we work with a framework that we say, okay, current crisis is ecological divide, social divide, and also a spiritual divide that has to do with not really connecting with our own deeper sources of well-being and creativity. So this guy, in his real life, he is a banker, but the role he plays here is Mother Earth, right? So we bring the voice of Mother Earth into the system. That's the ecological divide. We bring the voice of the underprivileged into, those are the fishermen, the farmer, so bring also in. And we bring the voice of the emerging future, with the children. And so you want to map the system in a way that's a little more comprehensive than just the existing stakeholders, and that brings other voices in. So mapping means first current reality and then morphing into an emerging future. So if we can switch one more. So that's using the same thing, but around a different topic, reinventing ICBC, the biggest state-owned enterprise in China, around big data. So what it means for how they relate to the customers, to the other communities, and so on. So you can apply it to any kind of a problem, of course, but then you try to take a little more extended stakeholder view. Can I just do it? All right. All right. So a different technique, which is 3D modeling, which is you model the system with objects, and then you go around and you model first current reality, then the emerging future. In this case, it's all the leaders of the various business units within Alibaba, in order to use it to map the interdependency in their ecosystem, right? So they do that maybe in, it's 50 people, it's maybe 8, 9 different tables, and then they look at the patterns that emerge from that. Here, the same technique, but with 150 people. So you can easily scale it, and it just means that you stay the same group size, but then you make people look at each other's results. So you quickly, even in a bigger group, identify the key themes, the deeper topics that need to be addressed, say in the second half of that bigger workshop day. So the last thing, and the main thing actually, I want to share with you is related to the question of technology and how to bring these kinds of processes to scale. So we have developed these other, so the social technologies that allow groups, complex stakeholder groups, to go through this ego to eco mindset shift. We have done it many times. Other people have done it. So we all know it's possible, but it takes a lot of effort, right? So the big question on the table really is, how can you bring that to scale? And that's where, of course, the question of technology comes in. And last year, we launched an experiment where I believe for the first time, we tried to link two things. One is MOOCs, so the idea of massive democratization in the access to knowledge, learning, and technology. On the one hand, Now, we know it has been a success, like the last 5 years, very interesting developments, but learning stayed flat, right? So learning and education was in bad shape before. Now it's worse because everyone is just looking at the screen, and how's transformation supposed to happening that way? So in other words, it's working well. MOOCs are working well for the transfer of technical knowledge. It's not working at all for developing these deeper capacities of innovation and leadership. So our question was, can you link these two things, right? The MOOC and massive democratization on the one hand, and the activation of the deep learning and innovation cycle that I indicated before, opening the mind, the heart, the will, on the other hand. That was the experiment, and I want to, so we started that early last year, and I wanted to begin with a little video clip that we created that would, for inviting people into this space, because we knew the only way of doing it successfully is to radically decentralize the space of learning. So to move kind of from one place that you basically set up for others to a radical decentralization where people self-organize in their own communities. All right. So let's, I'm also showing the clip because it takes you inside into a tour into MIT, into the MIT architecture, which is a perfect embodiment of the old mindset, right? Based on which not only education today is organized, but also all organizations really kind of tend to operate, which is a distinction between abstract knowledge at the top and applied knowledge at the bottom. So that's kind of the old paradigm. And throughout that clip, we'll kind of share with you the big disruption that's going on in the space of learning that really kind of turns that old paradigm upside down. So what this first clip really did is to tell the story of disruption that I believe is currently going on in the field of learning and leadership, which is two transformations. The first transformation is shifting the outer place of learning from the classroom, listening to folks, to the real world, learning by doing. And the second transformation concerns shifting the inner place of learning from the head to the heart and from the heart to the hand. So a more, you could say, holistic kind of, that's not only kind of limited here, but that includes the emotional intelligence, kind of the relational capacities on the one hand, but also kind of the learning by doing on the other hand. And what it really is organizationally is kind of, it's bursting up, it's kind of opening the old dome, right? So the old model of learning, everyone is sitting inside that dome, not a single window outside, and you are inside, captured inside in these classrooms, to a more open structure where people can freely moving in and out. And that's kind of what the second clip is about, which is inquiring more into what really then is the new architecture. And so I want to briefly show that one, and then share kind of the three main learnings that we had from running this experiment last year. This clip basically shows a little bit kind of the deeper evolution of the learning and action science space that actually goes back to the 1940s, and Kurt Lewin, who actually left in the 30s Berlin when the Nazis took power, went to the East Coast and was the main source of inspiration of founding what today is called action science, which is the reason why I left Germany 20 years ago, going to the East Coast, because I wanted to learn that methodology, which starts with the sentence that you cannot understand a system unless you change it. In other words, as a social scientist, you have to engage with, you have to participate in the change processes, otherwise you're just getting stuck at surface data. You want to understand the deep data that's underneath. And so it's kind of that lineage that also includes the limits to growth study, right? That, you know, in the 1970s sparked the global environmental movement. And that brings us now all the way here. And I think the interesting thing at the end is, and what we see today, is that we see a deeper personalization, kind of the deeper, the questions of awareness, of mindfulness, we see is very, you know, present in society today. So here are the three things that we learned. So that was basically these two clips we put out, and we said, okay, if you're interested in self-organizing, you know, in activating such a deep learning process for yourself, join this experiment, kind of create your own hub. Here are the three things that we learned. The first one is that we had quite a significant resonance. So in the first year, last year, you know, it was a total of 75,000 registered participants. It doesn't mean that really everyone kind of participates the whole thing. So the hardcore, of course, who did the whole 7 week and then the 7 week prototyping after that, it's a smaller group, but it is yet, even for conventional measures, a very significant group that engaged in this process, which took many, many hours in all these different places to self-organize, to form place-based hubs. We were inspired by the Obama campaign, actually, originally, which is link technology with local grassroots mobilization. We wanted to do the same thing. Create your own hub in your own living room. Invite your friends. And, you know, form a group in your company or in your living room or your community space that allows you to go on that journey together, not just alone. And so here are a few pictures. China, Chengdu, Mumbai, India, Sao Paulo, and then Oakland, Bay Area. So it's a lot. Not all these groups. So these were some of the larger groups, but there are many, most of them were actually much smaller, right? So 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 small groups kind of that came together. The second thing that we learned is that institutions, so that's kind of the bottom-up grassroots. But what was interesting is that even in the first year, we saw several institutions using ULab as a mobilization tool. So in this case, Alibaba used it kind of for their own capacity building, leadership development. Then Scotland, you know, used it. The Scottish government used it as a way to reinvent government from the old model that we all know, which is we create resources that we give to agencies who deliver services to beneficiaries, right? The beneficiaries are frustrated, the frontline people who deliver the services suffer burnout, and everyone is. Now that's the old model. What they now try is a different model, kind of what's called asset-based, which is you use the resources to activate the community themselves, to identify what they would like to do, kind of, you know, where the real needs are, and then to co-generate, to co-produce these services. And they use ULab, the 7-week kind of self-organized capacity building around change initiatives that they define as a mechanism to mobilize. So it involved more than 1,000 people last fall. And this is an NGO in China. It's the #1 China on reinventing education in China that partnered up with us a few weeks ago. We had a launch meeting to use the ULab approach to massively bring innovation creativity into the education system in China by, you know, bringing all the communities, the innovators of the education system together, and use the MOOC structure to scale and accelerate the replication of what's working. Now, the last thing we learned is that you could, which is maybe the most interesting, that we could engage the global community of tens of thousands of change makers as a whole. So you see an example here. So in each, we had 4 live sessions. In each of them, we use global moments of stillness, right? Mindfulness practices, in which the awareness was, not only focusing on, your own body, kind of in the field around you, kind of the local group you are connected with, but also the global body, kind of the collective body of change makers, around the world, across all these hubs that came together in that moment and started to interact with each other, which was a moment of transformation and inspiration for many, as we learned afterwards. So we also engaged the entire group in knowledge creation processes. So this is, I'm not going into details here, but it's a 1-page summary of what the U process is, which is the 4 levels of systems change: micro, individual, groups, organization, system. And on this axis, we have 4 levels of consciousness, kind of different, moving from, downloading old models to deep listening and, the transforming conversation, transforming the way we organize, transforming the way we coordinate, basically from old style to emerging new. And kind of more horizontal and more co-creative in how coordination and collaboration works. Now we ask people, okay, that's the map. Where are you operating today? And this is what they said. Kind of, we basically operate on the first 3 levels. And then we ask, given the challenges that you face on all these different levels, where do you need to operate from in order to respond to these challenges appropriately? And this is what they said. It's kind of the level 4. When we saw that, we asked them, wait a minute, you just said, this is what you need to do. This is what you really do. Why? What's holding you back today on all these levels to actually operate from this more co-creative space of connecting with others and collaborating with others? And here's what they said. So we said, give us your response in 3 words. And the word cloud that resulted from that basically can be summed up with greed, fear, and ignorance, which also in Buddhism are known as the 3 poisons. At the end, so that was at the beginning of the 7-week journey. At the end of the 7-week journey, we asked them, okay, now that you have better connected with what you really want to try to do with, with your life and your work, what would it take for you to actually bring that into reality? And this is kind of what they said. What it would take is courage. And then we asked, okay, and if you really committed to do that, if you could kind of mobilize that, tap into that courage, what is the help you need from others to succeed? And this is what people said: love, listening, and trust. So if you step back and say, okay, what is it that we learned from our global community of change makers, is what they really told us is this, that transformation today happens around, or leadership happens around 3 transformations, which is transforming ignorance to listening and curiosity, transforming greed to love or empathy or compassion, and transforming fear to courage. So it's these 3 transformations that we believe, or kind of that global community of change mirrored back to us, is really what's at the heart of the current leadership challenge that we face, not only in small pockets, but that we face if we start to address the bigger system issues. In the exit survey, we learned that those that responded, a third of them said life-changing. So how could that possibly be true? Well, certainly not by watching videos, right? You don't have a life-changing experience. I mean, you're touched. It's not a life-changing experience. The only way, this is self-reported, of course. But the only way that makes sense is that the main experience of learning that people had was really facilitated in all the self-organized groups. In all the self-organized groups that met either in person, kind of the coaching circles and the place-based groups that either met in person or using Google Hangout or other technologies that made them connect virtually, which we enabled through a platform. So I started with the question, what does it take to address kind of these processes and challenges of disruption? And what I basically said is, what it takes is two things. One is a process, which is okay, interesting. So it's a process that kind of moves through these stages of kind of observing, kind of connecting to the inner sources of knowing, and prototyping, learning by doing, on the one hand. And then the other, to make this process work, is to engage in this inner leadership work, which has to do with curiosity, compassion, and courage, or open mind, open heart, open will. That's basically the story that I told, and I think what we, of course, also see is that in reality, often the opposite is happening. So this is actually, when you play it on the Mac, it's actually looking the other way around, but never mind. So it's kind of the cycle of absencing, right? That is that I try to indicate here, which is not kind of this process, kind of opening the mind, the heart, the will, but it's the opposite, which is what we see today in larger scale, playing out around us in corporate politics, in larger systems. In most systems today, we collectively create results that no one wants. And so that has to do with ignorance, greed, and fear, as shared before, which means that we are moving through a cycle of denial, desensing, absencing, disconnecting with our true purpose, and then kind of into a process of destruction as opposed to a process of co-creation. So that's basically, I believe, the world we are living in, and that we see on the one hand all these processes and networks of innovation. On the other hand, we also see kind of lots of evidence. We don't only have to look to Donald Trump kind of to see the evidence, kind of the industry of fear, of anger and blaming others, and of ignorance, really, kind of that is giving rise to a lot of phenomena that suggest that in the current evolutionary threshold we are standing in collectively, we could move backwards very easily, kind of. And I think that the interesting moment we all live in is that we actually participate, and or we have the possibility to participate in that process, where the mainstream of our evolution will either tap more deeply into this co-creative space, or whether we kind of on a collective level more and more are sucked into this other space, which is really fueled by the economies and kind of the industry of ignorance, blaming others, and anger and fear. So that's, I believe, why the heart of this challenge has to do with using technology in a new way. That is not just amplifying this stuff here, which we see kind of in many old-style networks going on today, but that allows us to bring these types of processes here that we all know are possible, and each of us has already participated in on a smaller scale, to bring them to the level of scale that's really necessary today. That's what we are passionate around. We will love to learn from, partner deeper with what you guys are doing here in Berlin, but also Google, in general, and in other locations. And we think that my experience is, my first Google visit, I remember kind of don't do evil or something. That, I don't know whether that's still part of the corporate culture, but I think that there's always, at the heart of the new technology companies, there is the aspiration, making the world a better place. Yet, that's not always what happens, right? There's technology is also used for this stuff here. So I find it, what I would love to learn from you is kind of where you see yourself and how we can partner more deeply to really bring these types of new environments to scale. Because what we learned is the openness of people, right? 75,000 people joining up for the prototype year, right? That's like a massive amount of willingness, but also of capacity to self-organize in completely new ways and kind of use technology kind of with more intention and kind of for more deeper, more dialogue-based processes. Anyhow, that's what we are passionate around, because we feel that the technology-enabling conditions that we have formed so far are very insufficient. Yet they work great, but they are still very insufficient, right? The social media we have now are mostly downloading, right? Kind of broadcasting stuff. It's not activating these deeper innovation processes. To do that, we need each other, and that's why we're here. Thank you.